Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Queen Mother Speaks. I'm Teresa Kemp, Faces of Rap Mothers historian. I am an Underground Railroad quilt code expert. My family did the Underground Railroad quilt code. And today, on this episode of Queen Mother Speaks, we are taking you on an Underground Railroad quilt code field trip. Yes, so call all your quilters, friends, family, call historians, call genealogists. Our guest today, and in studio with my co-host, Dashanaba King, you're going to get to talk to the co-author, KJ Williams, of our book, Keepers of the Secret Code. Today, you're going to find out what youth did on Southern plantations. You're going to find out the meanings of the quilt code. You're going to find out so much more. So please sign in. Let us know where you're viewing from. Prepare your questions. We want you to like, share, and subscribe because Queen Mother Speaks is live. So let me introduce and let them say hi. Queen Mother Dashanaba King, Queen Mother Denuno the First, KJ Williams, the author. So ladies, greet our studio audience. If you would, Karen.
Hello.
It's a beautiful day. I am delighted to be here. I can't wait to go on my school field trip today. I'm looking forward. Thank you for this.
It's exciting. So KJ is the co-author of Keeper of the Secret Code with me, and we did a book launch in Oklahoma. I haven't done one yet in Atlanta, Georgia, but what's so exciting is that she and I went to quite a few bookstores and we went to quite a few schools in 1 week. It was a whirlwind trip. When I arrived in Oklahoma, she picked me up at the airport and we went to Marla Jones's house. That was the first time I ever met the publisher and only the second time that I ever met Karen. So, Dashanaba, if you're ready, we'll have you introduce our guest, KJ Williams.
Okay, well, before we go to introducing the guest, KJ Williams, who is definitely in the house, I'd like to say thank you for tuning in to Queen Mother Speaks. Our theme for this season is If Not You, Who? If Not Now, When? The time is now. And the whole concept of the theme is to encourage you to take action, to step up, to step out, and begin to do some things that you know that you want to do. This is your time. You can do that. I would like to ask you to continue to keep yourself safe, continue to wash your hands, and continue to keep tuning into Queen Mother Speaks. It is a safe space for inspiration and expression. So, what is this thing called Queen Mother Speaks? It is a community platform for conversations that matter. We do commentary on issues to inform, to inspire, to ignite, to incite. We talk about expatriating to Africa. We bring on guests and we give you what we call witty dialogue with our guests. And we also bring you inspirational quotes. Now, today we're not going to do the inspirational quote. What I'm going to do is to just go right into introducing who our guest is for today. And as you know, Miss Karen has been on the Queen Mother Speaks show before, but today we're doing something a little different. It is a school trip, but a little bit about the wonderful, the magnificent, the one and only Karen J. Williams. Well, she is a former school teacher. She's a media specialist. She's a mother of two. She's a grandmother to six. She's a longtime member of the Society of Children's Writers and Illustrators. Now, Karen is one who has always loved to read. She always loved opening up the world of books and stories to kids. She says, when I began to host authors and illustrators at my school, I saw the profound impact that had to motivate kids to read and write. So it is at that point that Karen said, I knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. What a profound statement, because so many of us, we still don't know what we want to do in our life. It's good for you, Karen, that you found out early, but that you also started doing it. Okay. Now, Keepers of the Secret is the story closest to my heart, she says. This story, Secrets of the Secret Code, Karen says, inspire kids to appreciate their freedom today while acknowledging characteristic traits such as, say, ingenuity, persistence, courage, and self sacrifice for the greater good of the matter or your race or for the cultural obstacles that you may have to overcome. The story, she said, took many years to write and took many years of rejection, many years of tears, and many years
Yes.
of rewrites. Can you hear that? Everybody out there who want to do a story, you may not get it right on the first time around, but as long as you stay in the game, there will always, always, always be hope for you. Okay? She says when she accidentally found Teresa Kemp, who is the co-host of Queen Mother Speaks and also known as Nana, she was installed in Ghana as a Queen Mother. She said when she found Teresa from just surfing on the net, right?
Yes.
What that meant for her is that she had been blessed. She had found something that she could been looking for, and she could not believe her own eyes.
Yeah.
She couldn't believe her own eyes. And so they did. So one day she did pick up the phone. She did make that phone call, and she got to talk to Teresa. All right. And when she talked to Teresa, she found out that Teresa was a direct or is a direct descendant of the Pharaoh family. And she knew at that point that she had been blessed. She felt like God had given her the omen that she needed to work on this story because she truly had a strong interest. And even in her family, if I remember, her mother also had an interest in quilting and in coats. So we are going to say, Karen, thank you again for being on the Queen Mother Speak Show. Karen, thank you for making that call. Because you made that call that day, I am able to introduce you on the Queen Mother Speaks show today. That warms my heart. That absolutely warms my heart. Karen, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to the one and only Karen Williams. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Boy, that introduction got me all choked up. I mean, that's very emotional. But this book was an emotional journey. But um, I had a passion for this story, and it started with this book. And I'm not going to go back into the history, but this was an adult book that broke the quilt code story and about how enslaved people in America used the quilt codes to escape slavery. And you can see the quilt codes behind me. Now, my mother's the quilter. I'm still learning. I have a long way to go. And she got interested in this book. And so she started sewing all the codes. And behind me, you see the sampler that she sewed. And Teresa, my co author, is going to talk about those in a minute. But I want to tell you a little bit about our book, Keepers of the Secret Code. It is an historical fiction book, which means it's based on history, which is Teresa's ancestors' history, just as Queen Mother just described. And it's got some made up parts, some fiction parts to make the story flow. So, but it is based on the history. So I want to start with the history. And the historical part of our story is based on American history. And it was a dark time in our history. It was late 1700s, early 1800s. And it's something that is very sensitive and emotional. This was our United States at that time. We weren't even a United States yet in American history. And you can see this Mason-Dixon line here. And this was the line where down here there were southern plantations that grew cotton. You see the cotton back here? And they would pay slave traders to go to other, as they were trading throughout the world on sailing ships back in the day, and they would kidnap people, I'm sorry to say, and bring them to work in these big fancy plantations to work the cotton and tobacco. There were other products, but cotton and tobacco, because the North was desperate for those products. So this was, like I say, late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, our story is set in South Carolina, And our plantation is Dover Plantation, which is based on a true plantation where Teresa's family was. And during this time, there was called a fugitive slave acts. There were actually two. It's really frustrating that there were two, but the first one was in 1793. And in 1793, they passed an act that said if enslaved people got to the northern states up here, do you see the northern states above this Mason-Dixon line? If they got to the northern states, those were non-slave holding states. So these states up here did not believe in slavery and were totally against it. And actually, America, if you know American history, went to civil war about this. It was a horrible war during Abraham Lincoln's presidency. And it was really based on the fact that the Northern were against slavery and the Southern states wanted slavery. So the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793, and that meant that if an enslaved person got to the north, one of these states, they could be free. But so many escaped that they passed another law in 1850 that said even if the enslaved people down here got to the north after all this, and usually it was Ohio, got to the north, they could still be captured and brought back by their masters. So guess where they had to go then? Clear to Canada, which is north of the U.S. So
Kim, quick question. We always hear that the northern states didn't want slavery, and that's true because it was the majority of people. But as we know, Frederick Douglass, he and Harriet Tubman escaped from Maryland slavery situations. So it was important, the Fugitive Slave Acts, that everybody didn't agree. Just like now, sometimes people do not agree. So no single statement that we're going to say today covers all of America. Because
there's always exceptions.
Exactly. Well, there was slavery in New York and in Ohio and Kentucky. Levi Coffin and his family were in Indiana, and they were abolitionists helping people escape. So there's hundreds of people all over the world. Slavery did exist all over the world, and we want to make that plain because sometimes when we talk about slavery, Karen, it seems like only in America did we have slavery, but it's been since the biblical times, everyone. And every place in every country in the world had slavery except for Ethiopia has never been colonized, and Switzerland didn't have products that required large industries of people to come in and work. So now, Karen, back to you. Continue our journey on the Underground Railroad quilt code story.
Okay. So that is true. World history and some American history. But our book is based on just a piece of the history. I want you to understand. But don't we all love secret codes? I mean, really, kids love secret codes. And by the way, for you that are listening, that are considering this book for a school purchase or homeschool purchase, or your children or grandchildren, this is a 4th through 6th grade reading level. It is a short book. And it has large print, and we have a glossary in the back. I love to say that. And the glossary explains some of the terms, and it also gives a definition of the quilt codes, which she's going to talk about. And then it's got some interesting historical photographs. Like this right here is a slave tag, which I don't want to get off on a tangent, but this was a slave tag that was worn by her great-great-great-grandfather, Peter, which in our story, we made Peter a young boy about to have his 12th birthday. He's 11 when the story opens. And I don't know if you can see in this picture, and I'm terrible with this camera, but in the top of this, they're picking cotton. And look at those sacks. I mean, when we say, oh, I'm going to go out and pick a basket of cotton, it was not like this little basket right here that I have. It was a huge burlap sack that is so long. It was, look how long that sack is dragging. Okay. And they had quotas. They had to pick so much cotton every day. And these quotas were, well, how much was it, Teresa? Like hundreds of pounds?
Hundreds. Children picked around 150 pounds. Adults were expected to do 700 to thousands of pounds of cotton a day to stay out of trouble. And they pick cotton from what's called can't see to can't
Can't
see.
see.
That's when
Yes.
it's dark in the morning. And when they finish working, it's dark at night. So
Right.
while the people were outside in the fields, when they got hungry, they cooked right there in the field. They didn't get to go home and take a lunch hour. There was no Starbucks. There were no McDonald's or fast food places. And they made something called hoe cakes. So, Dr. have you heard of hoe cakes before?
I have, but I'm not going to say anything more. I'm not going to spoil the fun of it.
Well, on the hoe, which is a farming tool, it has a blade with which they till the soil, get the weeds out from around the cotton, and they would make a fire in the field and take cornbread batter and put it on the hoe and actually make hoe cakes. And later on, we're going to tell you about some of the other words that Karen just loves to tell the story about.
I
Because,
have my.
go ahead.
Wait a minute, ladies. Let's go back to this hoe.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So are you telling me that they would take the hoe
Yes.
and put some maize around it,
Yes.
the hoe itself, and
Put
put
it
it
on
in
the
the
blade.
fire?
On the blade. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
They would put it on the blade.
Yes. Which was wider than two
Okay.
hands together. It was wider than that. So you're looking at probably a
Yeah.
12-inch by almost 1 foot blade. They don't have those little tiny hoes that we have and do our work. They had these big industrial quality blades that were huge, and they were flat and at a right angle like this on the blade. And so I need to turn my hand the other way, but they would
Yeah.
actually put the batter, they heat up the blade, pour the batter on, and make a flat pancake called a hoe cake. Today we cook in a frying pan, but they didn't have frying pans and everything else. And they got to eat those, and also something similar to like a beef jerky, but then they had to keep working. If a mother had a baby, she carried the baby wrapped in a wrapper on her body, which they still do in Africa and throughout the world today. We now have them in America because it's comforting for the baby to hear your heartbeat, or you could put them on the back. But one of the men that worked, Isaac, who worked at my museum in South Carolina, the South Carolina Wilds Heritage Center, his mother could pick more cotton than any man in this county. And she put him on a sheet at the end of the row, or the wrapper that she had on. And then she'd pick cotton all the way down the row and then pull him to the next row and then go down up and down the next row picking cotton. And you've heard me talk about at a field trip in person, we allow the children or guests to actually feel the bowl of the cotton because it sticks up.
Yes.
It has these really hard, sharp prongs. So cotton starts out closed, and you see those little brown pieces on it. When it opens up, that's when the cotton grows, and it opens those little brown things up like fingers, and the cotton grows out. But the brown hard part is still there, and it's sharp. So it actually cuts the fingers. And my great grandmother, she would make a salve, and they'd put it on their hands at night so they could go back to work in the morning. So we've learned a lot about herbal remedies, and remedies, treatments, and cures have been passed down because it's always said that the people didn't have hospitals that they could go to. But near where my family was enslaved on the Dover Hall plantation, the Pierce Butler plantation, or the Butler plantation, was nearby, and they had over 1,000 people enslaved there, and they did have a hospital there. So Eliza, who was a quilter, would go, and she was a midwife and birthing babies, and she would take Peter in our story with her, and he learned about herbs and remedies and helped her treat people at hospitals. He'd have to go empty all the stuff they used. He would thread needles, and many people don't know what youth did on plantations in the South, or the role of children. And so Karen thought that she wanted to write a middle grade book from being a librarian. There wasn't a book in the library for the middle grades, though they cover Underground Railroad history in school. So, Dosh, did you have Underground Railroad or any African American history when you were in school? Do you remember?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say I got a lot of it from school, but I did get a lot of it from my own family, who are also historians, archaeologists, genealogists, growing up as a child. My mother and father, uh, I finished high school before my mother or father ever got to finish high school. They went back as adults. But they were very, they believed very strongly in education. So we knew a lot. And we
Okay.
also associated ourselves with other educators. So I would have to say I was blessed in that area to
So
know,
you were
to learn
homeschooled.
at an early age.
And Karen,
Huh?
what about you?
Oh, yes. Well, no, we really didn't talk a lot about the Underground Railroad back in my generation. We were in the Midwest. I was raised in Missouri. But, and I want to tell you, everyone I talk to, every adult, I mean, I'd say 90% of them have never heard of this story, have never heard about the quilt codes. So it is, even though there was an adult book back in the early 90s, there were no, again, middle grade. And that's what inspired me. There were a few picture books that alluded to the quilt codes, but there was no middle grade. And like I say, in Oklahoma school curriculum, where I have been a teacher for 39 years, um, the Underground Railroad, Civil War, that time period in American history, is taught from fourth to sixth grade. And so I mean, not that picture books can't be taught to fourth and sixth grade or read to them
Right.
or encouraged. I'm not putting that down, because picture books have their place in all ages.
Right.
But there is not a middle grade. So that's why I thought this was so important. Actually, my mother and I, and if you saw the previous show, we actually presented a program about the quilt codes without this book.
Yes.
And I watched children be so inspired by the story. And our story is an inspirational healing story. Teresa and I agreed on that right up front. We are telling history. So yeah, there's some scary bad parts that we're not proud of. But as all people know, I shouldn't say all people, but as most people agree, we learn from our history, and we learn what not to repeat and what to watch out for and to respect people. But let me go back to the cotton thing, because
Okay.
the very first of our book, Peter is terrified of being sent to the field to be a field worker and pick that cotton. And like I say, it wasn't just like you go to your vegetable garden and pick a few things and go back into your air conditioned house. I mean, it was brutal. People died out there. They weren't even given enough water. They only had, once in a while, the overseer, he was not the owner of the plantation, but he was the usually very brutal, cynical person who uh, who would only let them have a few water breaks. So I just want to read the first couple of paragraphs of our story, and we do have a few black and white illustrations here. So from the time I was, now this is Peter talking, 11-year-old Peter. From the time I was knee high, I had nightmares of being forced to pick cotton. I could feel overseer's wolf eyes watching, always on me. I don't know why, but I sensed he wanted to break my spirit by working me hard in the fields. As a young'un playing around the big house, I'd forget that he was there sometimes. I'd seen small children faint dead away from working can't see to can't see in the plantation's tobacco and cotton fields. If and I survived the suffocating Carolina sun, I'd likely feel the whip on my back, because I knew I'd never be able to pick enough cotton, over 100 pounds a day, to satisfy overseer's quota. I felt safer when I was 6 years old, because Master made me the fetch and carry boy. My daily chores were filling the wood boxes in all the rooms of the big house, pulling weeds in the vegetable garden, and taking care of the horses, including shoveling out the stalls. I milked Bessie and Mort, their cows, and helped out at mealtime, along with whatever else I was told to do. But lately I felt jumpy. I wanted to do something different, take on important chores, bigger chores, be respected like Papa, Dover Hall's blacksmith, or Sam, the plantation's carpenter. But when you is an 11-year-old enslaved boy, you don't get to choose anything about your life. And then he goes to protect the
Wow.
carpenter from the overseer. And when he makes a decision, the overseer starts whipping the carpenter that he was just talking about, Sam. And when Peter goes to protect him from the overseer's whip, things start to go downhill from there. And then overseer is really after him to get him out in the field. He resents the fact that he is working in the big house, or with the big house, but he does so much. We have a whole section about how they washed clothes and boiled in these big pots. And that was wash day was an adventure. Let me, if I can find the camera. There we go. So look at these pots. I mean, they're bigger than people, and they would boil. They'd have to bring out all the clothes and boil the blankets and all this. So anyway, there's a lot of history in this book, a lot of tidbits in this book. But basically, Peter gets on the wrong side of overseer. And another problem was, and this happened, I think, this struck me as a very difficult thing that I don't think we realized unless we lived in the time period. These children, Peter was born enslaved, okay? And he was born on that plantation. That's all he knew. But as a child, a very small child, he grew up with the master's daughter, Emily, in our story. And so they played together just as toddlers and kids would all over the plantation, had free roam. But suddenly, as he gets older, and in our story, it's 11, but actually, as Teresa will point out, most of the time it was 6 or 7 years old. Suddenly, they were torn apart. And no, you can't even talk to each other anymore. Peter would have to go out in the field and work, or go work daylight to dusk. And Emily would be off with some tutor somewhere in the big house, and, not supposed to get dirty, not supposed to be out there, in the fields doing anything. And so suddenly they were torn apart, and they would feel like family. In our story, Peter and Emily feel like family. And suddenly you're told you can't talk to your sibling anymore. You can't hang out with your sibling anymore. You work all the time. Well, this really caused a lot of emotional problems, I think, for both parties, the master's kids and the enslaved kids, either way. So we really bring that up as a major theme in our story, and how Emily is totally against slavery herself, and swears to Peter, I guess I should tell this part, swears to Peter that when I someday own a plantation, although women didn't get to own a plantation, technically when she married, her husband would own the plantation. But she said, we will not have enslaved people on our plantation. And she makes that promise to Peter on the beach one day. They pinky promise. That's what, with locked fingers and pinky promise, that they will try to change the world, even though their little part of the world, it can be pretty overwhelming. And, that's what it takes to change the world. It's one or two people that make a decision that we're not going to live the way the culture is telling us to live, that we're not going to hate each other because our ancestors hated each other, that we are going to change things and heal things. And that's how we wanted to write this story. Now I will, and at the same time this is going on with Peter, he's being hounded and watched by the overseer even closer, and he's dealing with the fallout that master won't let him hang out with Emily like they used to. So he's got enough things going on, and then his mom and dad spring on him that they've got a secret that they've been hiding because they didn't want him to get hurt, and it's working on the Underground Railroad. And his dad, being the blacksmith, was the only enslaved person that was allowed to travel from plantation to plantation, because the smaller plantations didn't have a blacksmith. This was a highly regarded talent. And since Teresa's ancestor was a metalsmith in Nigeria, in the Igbo tribe, before he was taken in as captive, he had that talent, that ability, that training already. So when he was sold to a plantation, boy, he was like a prized enslaved person. Even though on the census many times they did list, and Teresa has those censuses censuses of her family, and about how valuable they put a dollar price on these people, which is the saddest thing ever. And sometimes they weren't even listed by name, they were listed by number. But her ancestor, which is Peter's dad in our story, would have been the most valuable enslaved person on the plantation. And he got to travel, so he knew how to get out of the plantation. All right, I'm going to let her, Teresa, show you what she's got in her hand there.
So this is one of the bracelets. When we say metalsmith or blacksmith in America, we don't think of African men making bracelets like this. You can see my little bracelet I have on today. Mm-hmm. And you can see how big this one is. This weighs almost 10 pounds, and they're now called the Benin bronze. And you can see they put patterns on it. So on my Facebook page, Teresa Kemp on Facebook, I've put 25 photos. So you can see the patterns that were cut into the bodies of people who brought this quilt code to America. Many people think it's just the quilts, but this is an African textile language. Now, my computer tells me that the battery, for some reason, is running low, and I've added my phone to the conversation. So if I go out on my computer, I can switch over. So I am getting a slight echo, and I've muted that mic, but for some reason, I'm still hearing it. We've learned on Queen Mother Speaks, Karen, just to go with the flow.
Yeah.
We used to panic when we had technical difficulties, and that brings us to the quilt code and how I learned as a child. My mother's great-grandfather taught her to count to 100, taught them the Bible and the quilt code. So we've had living people in my family from generation to generation, and my book, Keeper of the Secret Codes, documents my African ancestry back to 948 BC in Africa. We have thousands and thousands of records. I have 12.
She just went.
Coming back. There we go. From the Dover Hall plantation, we have 2 wills, 1844 and 1858, that name Peter Jr.'s parents, Peter and Eliza Farrell, who did this quilt code. So many people thought that this wasn't true, but we have documented my oral history. And on the Facebook page, I put a picture when I went to the Ashanti Hene, who's the king in Ghana. I went to visit his palace and learn more about the Adinkra symbols. And you'll see pictures of the quilt patterns cut into the bodies of people that brought it. That is the secret of the quilt code. It's not just patterns, but it is an African textile language still in use around the world today. So my ancestors migrated from East Africa to West, and they were actually Hebrew. And on the pictures, I included one, which is a textile that has Hebrew symbols in it, made in Ghana. But what's so fascinating is the plantation owners didn't know the languages. So the African people could put these symbols behind me right out in front, because all quilts and beddings had to be washed and hung on the clothesline, or they'd throw them over hedges and bushes. So
Nana's camera looks like it's gone out, but she'll be back. But she's telling us the story of her family involved with the Underground Railroad. Many of us know bits and pieces of the history, but Nana's family is one of the few African American families that I know of personally in America who actually know a lot about the codes themselves, what they mean. All right, a lot of that is what you find in the book that Terry wrote and her mother were called Hidden in Plain View. So bottom line, what was hidden in plain view? The codes for the slaves to escape. What codes? Why? What do you mean in plain view? How did that happen? Tell us all about that. How did that happen? Well, as she stated earlier, many times the quilts, when they were being washed, were thrown over a fence. And the quilts that were thrown over the fence were the quilts that had these patterns sewn into them. Once again, the slave masters knew nothing of the codes, but the slaves did because they had learned them from being in Africa, many of them. So when they would see a quilt, if you will, hung over a fence and it had all of these different patterns on it, they knew how to read it and it would tell them in many cases what to do. For example, there is a code. Let's see if we can add her back to the stream. There we go. Yeah, there
Thank
is
you.
a code that's made like a bunch of arrows. When you see them on the quilt, they look like birds, but it's really an arrow. It's a code with a bunch of arrows in it. And depending on the way the quilt was turned, it would tell you what direction to go in. So if the arrows were pointing up, what do you think that meant? What do you think that meant?
They
What
were going to
what
fly
word do
north,
you associate the north?
Canada.
There you go. Back to you now. Back to you now.
Well, as you can see, I'm going to get some more light in here. And um, I'm glad I had told you what was going on in advance so that you would know. Sometimes we have to improvise. So, believe it or not, they had no electricity, children, on the Underground Railroad. No computers, no refrigerators. They didn't have air
Oh,
condition. And some of the quilt code, some of the houses had no doors. So, we also have pictures in the book because they put the symbols actually on the houses. Now, Peter and Eliza,
mm,
being metalsmiths and a quilter and a midwife, they were very valued, as Karen had shared with us. And it's important that you know that everybody didn't have beautiful houses, but the plantation documents that we have said that they had whitewashed cabins, that they had their own livestock in the back, they had vegetable gardens on the sides, and they had flowers. So we never hear this part about plantation life. And his mother would get up and cook his favorite meal in the morning. They actually had meat. They in the wills it said they have good and nourishing food, warm and comfortable clothes were supposed to be provided for them by name in the wills. And in 1858, when Peter and Eliza were supposed to be sold away, then Peter, his father, purchased their freedom actually in real life. This isn't the the historical fiction part. And that's the point I wanted to make, that all slavery was not equal. Now, I can't speak for everybody. Bad stuff did happen, but it's just like today. There are good people, and Peter's Jr.'s father, being a metalsmith, he moved from plantation to farm and even worked with businesses in the South. He was a pastor and an elder, and so he moved freely throughout the plantations, and he would plan slave escapes. The book Hidden in Plain View broke the story, but it didn't tell how the quilt code went. So behind me, you see one of the quilts. This is the last quilt my mom and I actually made, and I'm going to tell you the quilt code. So, Queen Mother, I need you to put Karen back in because I can't really switch the show from this. I'm really not positive on how to do it. But the quilt code goes: the monkey wrench turn the wagon wheel north, up the road towards Canada. Follow the drunkard's path. Follow the North Star by day. Follow the flying geese by day and the North Star at night, because it was the brightest star in the sky of all the constellations. And the people, they were very aware and always watched the signs in the skies because they didn't have any weather reports. They didn't have any computers. So to plant the crops, they had to use it. So the symbol at the very top is the monkey wrench. The North Star pattern is interesting because Frederick Douglass has a North Star on his bed. So
Now,
Karen's pointing to it. So that's the monkey wrench.
this is
Then the wagon wheels next.
the North
And they
Star.
had a Levi Coffin and other people who were abolitionists who worked on the Underground Railroad. They actually had false bottom wagons. So they could open it up and they would actually feed children, elders, people who couldn't walk or keep up or run. They would put them in a false bottom wagon. Then they'd put feed and grass or bags of grain and things, supplies for the trip on top of them. But that's what it meant. The method of escape for you is going to be a false bottom wagon or get your stuff ready. So then we have the North Star pattern. And this is one of the beautiful quilts Karen's mother made. And that was the motivation I had in wanting to work with Karen. And I had written in my things to do that I wanted to write a middle grade children's book or youth book. So next we followed the bear paw trail, and you see the bear paw pattern. And what's interesting, all of us do it as if the bear's feet go up and down, but all 4 feet actually face forward. So that's how I can tell the antique patterns from the modern pattern, because that is the modern bear paw quilt pattern. So we say follow the bear paw trail through the mountains. Soon you come to the crossroads. Now we'll find the crossroads pattern. I'll go ahead and tell you the patterns that are there. So she's got the basket pattern. When we get to Canada, when someone dies, we weave sweetgrass baskets, put wildflowers in it, and put it on the grave. Then she's got the diamond pattern or the 9-patch. It's this is a variation. And then we have the log cabin. When they're in Canada, our quilt code tells us build a log cabin. As many trees or timber that the people cut down, they own the land, because it's not like it is today where everybody has nice little houses. There was wide, vast, empty land. And so land ownership came from clearing the land. And the queen, the British queen, also allocated land. The Native Americans had land, which was taken, and they obviously didn't honor the treaties with them, giving them different land because they wanted to make room for settlers. But what's really interesting, some Native American tribes owned slaves, some Native American tribes were enslaved, and then some Native American tribes worked on the Underground Railroad. One thing that I did want to add was that where Karen is in Oklahoma, I went to Dallas, Texas earlier this year because they had a Southern Route Underground Railroad Quilt Code Convention, so they could document more paths on the Underground Railroad and learn more. So in my book, I talk about Southern routes and plantations and people who had farms that worked on the Underground Railroad. That route went from Florida through Mississippi, Alabama, and south into Texas and Mexico. And there are even Mexican abolitionists in my quilt code. The second president of Mexico, his mother is Igbo, and he's Hispanic. So people all over the world that were routes north, south, east, and west. Okay, so let's see what else she's got in this quilt. So
can I say one thing about this? Also, this meant, let's talk about the inside square there. If it, in our story, if it was a light square, it meant this was a safe house. This quilt might be hanging as the slaves were running. Okay, or and they got separated maybe from the blacksmith or the monkey wrench. They come across a house on their way north. Now they would be still in the States, and this quilt might be hanging out. And if it was a light color square, it meant that it was safe to come to the door. And again, those are the abolitionists, and they were all races and cultures that would hide enslaved people that were running in America, and that's what they called the Underground Railroad, and they would keep them and feed them, let them rest, and then they would move them to the next station or the next house, safe house. Now, some people think if the inside square was a dark color, it meant don't come to the door because the patrollers are watching my house, the house, or they might even be in the house to ambush any the enslaved group they're looking for. So, so this was also used in that respect as a signal that you will come to a safe house. Okay.
Right. Now, sometimes they would hang a lantern in the window, like in Cincinnati. They had a safe house there, and if the lantern's in the window, it was safe to come to. Now, she used the term patrollers. That's similar to bounty hunters that we have today. and they would go get anybody. They would put advertisements in newspapers of the period, and people would read the newspapers. One or two people would buy it, and then they'd circulate them through the community. And as you heard, Peter could read, his parents could read, but people in Africa read all the time. So if they took us today and we were enslaved, people could forbid us to read all they want to. We already read, we write, we speak different languages. And so it's not effective. We could have conversations in different languages.
But
And
doesn't that show you the power of reading?
yes.
I mean, why? And I have children in America are like, oh, I don't want to read. I don't have time to read. I want to play sports. I want to, my own grandkids.
Play computer games.
Yeah, computer games. But I'm telling you, there is power in reading. Power.
Yes.
Because many people that could not read, that were not allowed to read, would sign things that would sign away their life. And they didn't know what they were signing because they couldn't read it. So
Right.
I'm just saying, if they took it away, that tells me there was power in it, right?
Yes.
That tells you
Yes.
right there. They took away what they thought would help them escape and would give the enslaved people power, and that was reading. So,
Yeah.
so if you're listening, or if you're talking to your grandchildren, point that out, that there's so much power in reading. Okay, end of my soapbox on that.
And that's okay. But you know what else is really important, Karen, is writing in cursive. Most of our historic records are written in cursive. If you're an English teacher, you'll find that there's a character for SS. And so it's really interesting to study languages and even English throughout the period. I'm born in Germany, and I learned High English, or what's called the Queen's English. And when I came to America, we had car windows that would roll up, Karen, and I would say, oh, please wind it for roll up the window. And people looked at me like I was crazy. And in our story, languages have changed. But when the people were being chased on the Underground Railroad, they actually had dogs, just like today. We have police dogs, but they had bloodhounds, is what they call them, because they could get the scent of a person from their clothes or other objects they'd handled, and they would search for the people. Well, in order to get these dogs off of their trail, they made hush puppies. Now we have hush puppies with fish and chips, fish and French fries. And what they would do is they'd put medicine in it to make the dogs go to sleep, but to stop them from barking, because the dogs would run ahead of men or men on horses. The dogs were faster. The men weren't going fast. They were searching back and forth, weaving, and they were going on the straight lines of the roads. So following the drunkard's path meant don't go in a straight line, don't get on the major roads. Then we didn't have paved streets. And you could tell where you are in the country by the dirt. So in South Carolina, my family became what they call Gullah or Geechee, from coastal Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. They went from being Ibu, or from the Kingdom of Benin, which went from the Congo, and from Cameroon, I'm sorry, all the way over to Ghana. That was the Kingdom of Benin in the period. That includes Togo. Eliza was from Dahomey, and Peter was from what's now called Nigeria. But he would travel all the way doing the metalsmithing. They would do marriages. They would do, they had four large celebrations a year. They had fishing festivals. They had canoe racing. And here in America, they continued those traditions. But we never hear about quality of life of what people did when they were not working. They actually did celebrate the holidays. And in our book, we talk about a soiree, or a big party or a ball that they're preparing for. And that's what gets Peter and his friend in trouble, because he wanted to learn to dance, and he's doing all the preparations for the party. And Emily's getting this big, pretty dress, and she's getting her hair done and everything. But there were lots of different times, and we talk about them in the book. So it's important to add a more rounded view. And my family's story is positive because they did purchase their freedom. He did learn the Cook Code. He did work on the Underground Railroad, but we want you to get the book for the youth detention centers, libraries, after school programs, your homeschool groups and book clubs, so that you can find out what happens, because we don't want to, spoiler alert, we don't want to tell you the whole story. So Karen, on the quote behind you,
there's the drunkard's path. She was just talking about that, the drunkard's path right here.
Yes.
And
There's the Drunkard's Path quilt pattern.
and this is
But
shoe fly. And we
yes.
have a whole section about shoe fly. And
Uh-huh.
can I tell this part? I don't know how much time we have, but the shoe fly is so interesting. Okay, in America, we have this little sing-song thing that's very old about shoe fly don't bother me. And
Shoe
I don't even know
fly, don't bother me. Yep.
yeah. And so I always thought it was the fly. It's an
Right.
insect, right? But and
Because
it
you visited the
is
plantation, right?
right. But this is what's interesting. When we visited, I took a southern trip with my mother, and we visited some plantations in Natchez, Mississippi, and
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina, and it was amazing. We had this guide, and he was well, he had a doctoral degree in history to give you an idea. So he
Right.
worked for the national park. But I mean, this man was like you, Teresa, walking encyclopedia. And anyway, he explained the shoe fly. Well, the shoe fly was also sort of a, I hate to say, favored enslaved person because that's kind of an oxymoron, but he was a privileged enslaved person, sort of like Peter's
Yes.
father and mother were in the hierarchy of the plantation. And he was the only one allowed in the dining room to help serve the family, to be in the dining room when the master's family and the master's guests were actually in there. Now, others, Peter, being the fetch and carry boy, he would run the dishes, the food from the kitchen, which was separated from the big plantation house because of fear of fire.
Right.
So they didn't have it all connected. So he would run the dishes and he would hand them through these great big floor to ceiling windows with no screens, of course. And he would hand them to the shoe fly, and the shoe fly would actually sit them on the table. And then while the family was eating, the shoe fly was the only one that got to stay in there. And he wore gloves. He was all dressed up, probably a modern day butler is what I'm kind of thinking in my head.
Right.
And so while they were eating, they had no fans or electricity, as Teresa pointed out. So they had this
Right.
huge big thing that hung from the ceiling, and it was like
Right.
a paddle. It was a
Right.
huge modified canoe paddle, but they were very ornate and wooden and beautiful, and they hung very low to the table, these big long tables, because they loved to entertain. And it hung very low, and it would just swing back and forth on a pulley. And so they had a rope pulley that went, of course, to the ceiling where it was attached, and then over to a corner, and then it dropped down. And so it was manually pulled on the pulley to make the paddle move to keep the insects, the flies, away
Off
from
the
the
food.
food as they
Right.
ate. Now, a good shoe fly would be like a statue. Once he got the food on the table and the family was seated, he would step back in the corner and work the pulley and keep the insects off. But guess what he really did? He
Right.
listened. And I
Yes.
mean, he could hear all their intimate conversations. And sometimes, most of the time, they didn't even register he was there. It was as if he was invisible.
Right.
And so he would take the information he learned and report that back, especially through the kitchen staff, which would be Peter's mother, because usually the big house help did they did the sewing, they cleaned the house, then they did the cooking. It was kind of all part of their jobs. And so
Right.
that's when he would sit down with them and say, guess what I heard? The family is going to be gone during skeeter time, because skeeter time is
Right.
in our book about when malaria was rampant in the hot summer months. And many times the masters took their families north for an extended vacation because part of it was for health reasons so that no one
Right.
got malaria.
Now,
So
Karen,
that,
something let me go ahead and throw in here, because
yeah.
African people, when the insects would bite them or when mosquitoes bite them, they were more resistant to malaria and yellow fever. And as you travel in the South, you see a lot of cemeteries, and they're marked, the person died of yellow fever or they died of malaria. And so they would go to Europe or they would travel. And on the Dover Hall plantation, Thomas Dover and then his nephew, they were absentee owners. So 6 months out of every year, they were gone. And so Peter would work, Peter Sr., he would travel and work and do metalsmithing. Eliza was called to different plantations and homes to birth babies, and she took Peter with her because they'd be gone a week or more at a time, and they could plan slave escapes and hear when
Right.
someone was going to be punished harshly or killed, and then they would plan the slave escapes, and they would go immediately because the shoe fly had given them the information that they had heard, and they often had the guests from nearby plantations. They would get together on a regular basis, just like people get together and play cards or go golfing, or they go to parties and belong to different groups and organizations, and that gave them time to plan. And because little Peter had taken geography, he had access to maps and knew how to read maps just like Emily did. And so when I hear people discuss slavery, they're underestimating the intelligence of all people. And it's important that we have diverse groups of people working. So there were free Africans, free African Americans, and people of all races and faiths that assisted on the Underground Railroad internationally. And there were people who escaped from slavery, and at the time they thought, oh, they were somehow made differently where they couldn't read, write, and learn. But that wasn't true, because in my book, Keeper of the Fire, some of them actually, they escaped from a plantation, went to Europe, to Heidelberg, Germany, where I actually lived, and got PhDs or their ministerial degrees and raised funds, brought them back, like Levi Coffin, raised over $100,000 for contraband, who were escaped enslaved people who the Union Army put in camps to keep them safe all the way on the Underground Railroad. So
okay, we're
also,
about to have to go. So be
tell
sure to
them
tell
about
them where to buy the book. We got
Yes.
5 minutes, I think. So we're
Okay,
about to
yes, we
end.
do. We're running out of time, but we can run a little bit over. Dash, are there any questions in the chat room that we need to address? You can see the book is called Keepers of the Secret Code. You can get it from doodleandpeck.com. It's also on Amazon.com, Barnes and Nobles, Target.com. And we want you to ask your local bookstore to carry our book. We want you to ask your library to carry our book. This book is very important because it sets the tone for the next generation coming. We are peacekeepers and peace seekers, and we want everybody to work together. One of the things that I say on every show, Karen, is that there's a saying that people were mistreating Asian people. And because I wasn't Asian, I didn't help. And people were mistreating people because of their religious beliefs, whether they were Islamic or Muslim. But since I'm not Muslim, I didn't help. And then people were mistreating people because their skin color was different. But that wasn't me, so I didn't help. So when they came for me, there was no one to help. So it's important to me that you, like people, the Philadelphia Abolition Society, they were Black and white, free people who were in the North who raised money and planned slave escapes. They gave abolitionists Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And I wanted to mention on the Facebook page, I did mention that Frederick Douglass's wife, Anna Murray Douglass, it's his first wife, she and her quilt guild made quilts that were used on the Underground Railroad. And the North Star quilt is on Frederick Douglass's bed in Washington, D.C. when I went to his house. You need to go to Washington, D.C. and see that house, because that house is huge. It's like a governor's mansion, Karen, in most cities. It's bigger than a municipal building, and it's the home of a former slave. And though they teach that enslaved people couldn't read or write, we have poems from the 1700s. Frederick Douglass wrote his own story. We have so many books that were written by enslaved people, published by them, and it took a lot even for women. Phyllis Wheatley wrote poems in the 1700s. They had patents. So don't assume because you hear people couldn't read or write or people couldn't get married. I have marriage records from my family in Virginia back to 1843. And as you can see, there's so much that we could talk about.
Well,
we're going to have Karen back.
Tell about the theme. Tell it what is the theme of our whole book, the saying. Can you say it?
Yes.
Can you say
it's in the Hebrew language. So I'm going to tell you what it means in English. I was given a book that helped me document my family Culture and Movements Back to 948 by Dr. Anthony Anaquinze, who's a surgeon in Los Angeles, California. He gave me 2 books that made it possible. And he has become an Igbo chief, and he did run for political office. But it says, I will do my part. And he taught me the meaning of that. So we ask that each of you do your part in changing the world. And one person can change the world. A child can change the world. So this month on a previous show, you heard from my grandson who saved gorillas in Uganda. And at 8, he illustrated my book and co-authored Jamel's Deep Sea Adventure, where we passed my Underground Railroad history down from one generation to the next. So Karen's showing you the phrase in the book. I spoke before the Igbo World Assembly in 2013, and then went on a medical mission trip and a research trip with Dr. Anaquinze and the Anambra Medical Association. They did, the fewest was 400 free surgeries in one day. And then the most was 1,700, but we did 8 towns in 8 days of free surgeries and distributed 3 to 6 months of medication. So you can make a difference. Every generation in my family does AfriCare. So I want you to find out your family history. We want you to document your family history. We want you to get the book, Keepers of the Fire. We want you to get the book. Karen's got another book called Camp Not Allowed also. And we want you to get that book because it talks about the Native American culture. We want to highlight everyone's culture. So my family is African, American, Native American, Irish, English, and we have my European ancestry back to 149 AD through the Strother line. My great-grandfather is born in 1814. My mother's father is born in 1856. My mother's born in 1934, but she has 11 brothers and sisters born in the 1800s. So I have 44,000 artifacts and over 1,000 textiles, and we documented our family history. On another episode, Karen, we did the California Slave Insurance Database, and then we did voyages.org, which is the transatlantic slave trade, and that's done out of Emory University. So get the past shows so you can document your family culture too. And as Karen was saying, her mother's in Minnesota. So it's important that you learn geography. And where I'm from in Germany, they'd give us a blank sheet of paper, Karen, and we'd have to fill in all the countries and the capital, and on the back and other pages, we had to write 3 things that that country and the people were known for. So now we're not learning comprehensive geography. So parents, grandparents, communities, we want you to help bring the reading level of our students and adults back up really high. And as Karen said, it's so important for you to read. So as soon as she comes back on the screen, we're going to have Dr. or Queen Denuno, the first Queen Mother. She's also a queen in Africa, and the Queen Mother Speaks show was developed so that you would be able to know more about moving and going to Africa if you want to expatriate, or if you want to tour. We tell you about tourism throughout the world. And also, if you have to go to work, it's important to understand the culture and the timing and the weather. And just like I was telling you, the dirt in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida coastal lines has seashells. In South Carolina and like Mississippi and parts of Alabama, it's a red Georgia clay, and it looks like the soil in Africa. When you get to Kentucky and Ohio, it's brown dirt and continuing north. So from foliage on the trees, people could tell where they are because moss is in the south, but it's not in the north. And when I went to visit Karen in Oklahoma, there was no moss on the trees, and the birds, everything looked different over there. But I did see geese. So I felt really good because I was wondering, could they follow the geese by day if they were on the Underground Railroad? And they can, because the geese migrate south all over the country. And they also stop where there used to be water. So you'll see them in parking lots and things. Mm-hmm. So Karen, was there anything else you wanted to say?
I wanted to just say one last thing. I don't know how many of you get the American TV shows. There's 60 Minutes that was on Sunday night. And you
tell us about that.
you can look that up on your computer. Go to 60
Mhm.
Minutes Overtime. This is an amazing story of an African American enslaved family for generations that did not know their family history. As Teresa was talking about, they couldn't trace it because many times there were no names and birth dates and numbers of the
Mhm.
enslaved people. And so they traced their history. And this is an amazing story because I don't know if I should tell you the ending, but you need to watch the 60 Minutes Overtime. This man inadvertently, not knowing, ended up buying the plantation that his ancestors were enslaved on.
Mhm.
They are now the owners of the plantation
Oh yes.
that was his, and that were, I mean, that is unbelievable. And it, what he did when they bought it for the
Right.
family, they had no idea that their ancestors were enslaved on it. So it's 60
Exactly.
minutes, and I forget the name of the plantation, but
I do know that story, and I
oh,
have met
you
that
need to
family.
watch it. Everybody needs to watch it, because we're talking about tracing your family history and how important our family stories are. And this family, later, after they bought the plantation, traced it to their ancestors, and their ancestors are actually buried in the back of this plantation.
Right.
Yes,
Buried.
yeah,
They're
buried.
buried. So you
And
actually on
they don't have really,
findagrave.com, you
yeah, they
can
don't
find the
really have
graves.
headstones, but they are marked, and they were told that this is where the enslaved ancestors were buried. So they're going to restore that. And there's a log cabin there that was one of
A
their
national
ancestors.
slave, what they say
Yes,
is called slave cabin.
yes.
Those are
This
the
is in
houses that
Virginia.
enslaved people went to,
Yeah, this is
lived
in
in.
Virginia. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you for having me on, and thank you so much. Please buy our book, and I hope you learn a lot. There's a lot of history. You can tell Teresa put we wove a lot of history in here, like the hush puppy story, things that have nothing to do with the quilt codes, but of course the quilt codes are just amazing. So I think your kids will love it, your grandkids will love it, and I hope you learn something as an adult from it. So thank you for
Now,
having
Karen
me.
and I are both on Instagram, so you can contact either of us through
Mhm.
doodleandpeck.com, our
Mhm.
publisher. We
Mhm.
have Facebook pages, we have Instagram pages.
Mhm.
She writes under KJ Williams, which
Mhm.
is how she's listed on her Instagram page. I'm one keeper of the fire, and we want you to keep the fire of your family burning too.
Yeah.
So we want to
Okay.
thank our sponsors, and we want to thank all the
Yes.
viewers. Karen, go
Yes.
ahead. What were you saying?
I just want to say thank you for having me. I've been on twice, and I'm sure you've heard enough from me, but I love, love, love
Never enough.
this story. Thank you, Miss Teresa. All right.
Yes.
Talk to you later.
Okay. Bye-bye, Karen.
Bye.
So we're going to end the Queen Mother Speaks show now, but we thank you. Please tune in tomorrow, which is Thursday, for our Bunga Dada Bunga show. That Speak Sister Speak. We gave women voices during the Kenyan election, and it's a platform where you can hear about what was going on in Kenya during the election. There's usually a lot of violence for the past 30 years, but we wanted to do something for candidates who didn't have a lot of money, who lived in the rural areas, because if you run for office, it takes a lot of money. So we want to encourage you, participate in your local political situation, because that's your voice. People fought and died for years so that you could vote and your opinion can be heard. And only by registering to vote and actually going to the polls can you change your community situation. You can get money for roads, for schools, for books, for your area to be beautified and look really nice. You go some places and the town looks so pretty, and you go other places and it's all run down. And that's because the people didn't sign up for the census, which is done every 10 years, and they don't vote for people who are going to change their living conditions and make sure that you have rights and freedoms. So, Queen Mother, go ahead and tell us more, and thank our sponsors, and tell us who was in the chat room, who, if there were any questions we needed to answer.
Well, I really wanted to add in again the locations where the book can be purchased. So I got Doodle and Peck. I got
Mm-hmm.
that one.
Right. Then we have Walmart.com.
Okay, you can buy it from Doodle and Peck. Okay, where at
Uh-huh.
Walmart?
Walmart.
Okay. Well,
Target.com, BarnesandNobles.com.
mhm.
Your independent bookstores, they call them indie, I-N-D-Y, indie bookstores, which are your independent local bookstores. In Oklahoma, we're at Eleanor's bookstore. I mean, we're in museums, gift shops. Anyone can carry the book, and businesses can get the book from Ingram and other publishing companies that specifically provide books. And I often wondered what's the difference. But those books for your library have to have a stronger binding on the back. We have hard copies and soft copies of our book. And we had Marla and Karen on to talk a previous show last week to tell you about how to write a book and how to publish a book. So we want you to write a book about your family story with somebody that's a different generation, your mother, your parents, or grandparents, and tell us about your culture. So you can also get the book. You can just ask your library to carry Keepers of the Secret Code, Jamel's Deep Sea Adventure. That's talking about my Gullah roots, coastal conservation. It talks about, it's more a science workbook for youth. And I did it with my grandson. So you could learn more about the Gullah Geechee culture and conserving our water and animal and marine animals, which means those that live in the sea, so that they'll be there for generations to come. One of the things we were taught when we were little, I was telling him we would go down to the beach because we would catch our food. We have fish baskets, which is one of Karen's favorites, and we didn't get to that today, but we're basket weavers. I'm the last of the Gullah basket weavers in my family, and we would make it the lid so it comes back, and they put fish scraps or bones, chicken bones or other little particles of leftover food, and put it in the basket, and we sit it in the water with the lid open, Queen Mom. And what happens, the fish swim in. So in our story, Keepers of the Secret Code, Peter takes the basket down. They would also fish with fishing rods, but they would use the baskets. So the fish and crab and other things go in there, and then they pick the basket up, close the top, the water drains out, and they would take it home and prepare a meal. So there's so much to learn. Wow. We'll have to do this again. We want to thank you for joining us.
We will.
I did see Eleanor in the chat room who was in Nairobi. Thank you. Go ahead.
What I'd like to say is this was an excellent presentation today of the book. But
thank you.
Obviously, you can't do it all on one setting because the book is so rich and so full.
It is.
So what I'm going to ask that we do is we do this presentation again, but I want you to break the book down into parts. Don't try to do it all on one show.
Okay. Well, when we go for a field trip, we can't tell them we're there probably 2 hours. Yeah, and we wanted to get it even 40. We do 30-minute programs. We have every single quilt demonstrating the quilt code, but if we don't have enough room in your facility for that, or you have a smaller library, then or a classroom, then we bring the sampler quilts, which have all of the codes on it. But on the real Underground Railroad, they never had all the codes displayed on one quilt like this.
All of them together.
So, right. So if you are a teacher, the pictures of these quilt patterns cut on the body are on the Facebook page, and they'll be on Queen Mother Speaks Facebook page, Teresa R. Kemp, Teresa Kemp, and the Underground Railroad Quilt Code Museum has a Facebook page, but we're putting it across all the Facebook pages. You can write and ask us for. We have linking to literacy, which are handouts. We do gallery activities when we come to your business or your school or your facility to do the programs, but linking to literacy actually gives you handouts that you can give to your class, or if you're a homeschooling teacher, you can go and download those at doodleandpeck.com, linking to literacy page, and that gives you free resources and teacher resources to teach the Underground Railroad Quilt Code. We have crossword puzzles that we hand out. We have bookmarks that you can also email us or write us, UGRR Quilt Code Museum at gmail.com. And if you just Google my name, Teresa R. Kemp, then it brings up all the different ways you can contact me. And I'm working on being extremely timely with those requests. And we even come for field trips to a school near you. Now we're working on going to Kenya, Africa, because the Payapal Museum owner just had his 90th birthday. So I need to get there quickly. And so that we can continue documenting East African history. On the Facebook page, I have one of the several African textiles, but one is from East Africa, and it's hand painted and stamped leather crazy quilt with the quilt code patterns. On our blogs and websites, I have pictures of Egyptian cats with the log cabin quilt pattern on the mummified carcasses, block by block, intricate different embalming techniques to show you that this is not an American quilt code. It's not a colonial quilt code. It's been done for centuries. Anthony Browder's research has proven it. It's in a tomb that's dated 25,000 years ago in East Africa, in Kemet or Egypt. So it's so much to learn, like she said. Yes, one can't do it in one day, but go to our websites, go to our blogs.
We sign off today. Go ahead.
So we have a lot that we do at the end of the show, including blowing you a kiss. But before we do that, we want to thank our sponsors. And we are actually doing a project where we are trying to get reusable menstrual pads that come in a container.
We'll talk about that one on the next show. We'll talk about that one next time, because the time is running. 2 points I'd like to make. One is I want to encourage you, anybody living abroad, that you can vote from abroad.
Yes.
Go to www.votefromabroad.org. It is not too late for you to get your vote in for the midterm November election. Second, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to tell you about something that's happening tomorrow.
Okay.
It is called the Rule of Law of Age. The Rule of Law came of age in Africa. Will it die in America? Now, whether you believe it or not that there was an attempted coup, whether you believe it or not that there was an attempted coup, whether you believe it, there's no question that there were lawyers who were very pivotal in the strategics and the strategies that Donald Trump and the Republicans supporters devised for him to try to stay in power. On tomorrow, Thursday, September 1, I believe it's 12 noon New York time, 7 p.m. Kenya time, there's going to be a special report on the rule of law came of age in Africa. And the show basically is talking about how the 500 lawyers across America work with Donald Trump to try to overthrow the White House. You can get that by going to, you can click on this link, and this link will take you there. Okay, it's a lot of long numbers. I'll have to put it in the chat later.
Yes, I've posted it on my LinkedIn page, and we'll post the information on our social media pages, because that way you can click on the link.
I have
we'll put the flyer out.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gonna. I don't know. It's too long to try to type it all in right now, but I wanted to talk about those two things. Thank you very much for tuning in to Queen Mother Speaks. We always like to end the show with a kiss.
Yes.
Why? A kiss symbolizes love. And we believe that love can solve all the problems of the world, in the world, all worlds at any time. So when we blow you a kiss, we're blowing you a kiss from our heart. And we hope that it lands in a place and a space for you that can be healing.
Yes.
So are we ready?
Yes, we are.
Starting with the left hand. Right hand. And now we're going to take both.
Yes. And now I'm going to need you to make sure you can end the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we want to wish everybody a happy birthday. Yes. Go ahead.
Every Wednesday, every week, live at 5 p.m. Kenya time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for tuning in to Queen Mother Speaks.
Bye.